Hello and welcome to episode 33 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we chat with Matt Swarbrick, a farmer at Henbant. Matt shares with us the journey of Henbant and how he uses agri-wilding and holistic decision making to allow him to produce both delicious, nutrient-dense food and a thriving ecosystem for both nature and people. Chloe, hello.
Hello, Tom.
Well, this week has been a very food and production orientated week, hasn't it?
It has been. We've had some lovely visits, and I think this conversation has been part of a lovely journey to help us think about some of the priorities here at the farm.
Yeah, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail, and not to steal any thunder from the conversation with Matt, which is, well, he's an amazing communicator and his journey is fascinating and really interesting. But definitely we're going to talk about some actually pre-reflections, some reflections from the conversation that were things we've come across. But if you are new to the podcast, welcome. We are Chloe and Tom, husband and wife, and we are on a journey to restore nature to our site in Monmouthshire, as well as we'll talk about it, continue to produce from the land and help nature education and do outreach to people and schools and corporates to get them to understand what wilder nature is and how it could benefit them.
So as you were alluding to, Tom, I think it's important to reflect on how visions shift and priorities shift. And it feels like something that's been really important for us over the last 18 months, ever since we first moved to the farm, has become increasingly present in our thinking and in our planning.
Yeah, because it has always been there. If you go back to the earliest episodes, we talk about the importance to continue to produce from the land. And we want to go on a journey to work out how we do that in the most effective and delicious and interesting way we can. But there's a lot to be done on the land. We wanted to kickstart nature recovery. We started that here. We wanted to get the education centre built on site. And that's now started with a vengeance, and we'll be finishing middle of next year. We're switching fire, as a military term we would use. We're switch firing onto the next priority on our list. And having had one great visit and one great conversation with Matt, food now is like, how do we produce and what do we produce on site, and what's the purpose of what we produce on site?
And I think there is value in having taken our time, because we could have rushed into, we had so many ideas at the start, didn't we? We were thinking about vertical farms, mushrooms, market gardens, all of this was
honey.
All of these ideas have been on our whiteboard of complexity at various times as we've been trying to work out what the priorities are and what to focus on. But it does feel like we're refining down to what we really want to contribute and what makes sense for us given the location of the project, who we want our market to be. Because it's all very well to have an idealistic vision of growing food, but who's it going to go to? How are you going to sell it? You can't just grow food with no destination.
Yeah, and the two of the things we settled on at this moment in time, and it may change in the future, is a market garden for all the benefits we've learned about, but also I'm sure there'll be plenty of episodes coming up that we can talk about it in more detail. An ancient orchard, a mix of an ancient orchard to be precise. And one of the challenges of a market garden is, firstly, it's very time intensive. It takes a lot of time to manage and maintain, especially if you're trying to do it in an organic way. And it's fresh produce, therefore it should be, or traditionally, obviously consumed as quickly as it's picked. So that's we had to work out how we thought we'd solve that solution, because it was a long drive, it's a mile and a half down, and we certainly don't want or expect people to come up and down to get their veg. That's not a good solution. So we had to really work out how we were going to get our hopefully tasty food into the mouths and bellies of people that can enjoy it.
We're really lucky in this area, as we've talked about on the podcast before, that we have some existing market gardens locally that produce fantastic food that we're part of the community supported agricultural schemes for. So what we wanted to create here it's actually something that's going to meet a number of functions. So it's going to meet the function of producing food, which we're going to plan, or I guess using those kind of principles of holistic decision making, which Matt will go on to talk about, is going to meet the needs of the guests that come to our education centre. And when the schools, the corporates, even our community members come, we want to be able to offer them some beautiful, fresh, nutrient-dense food that's been grown on the site with all the benefits of the wilder ecosystem around them. So we've been thinking about, how do we create a market garden that produces food that we can make into soups, salads, things that we can store for when our guests come into the site? How do we make it accessible so that when young people come, they can also get involved with growing seeds and weeding and helping to harvest vegetables that they might even cook using some of the facilities on site? So it's all about, how do we make it meet the needs of the system and which it's part of?
And just connect people to the site more. If they know what they're eating and it's delicious and it was grown 100 meters away, then hopefully that will just allow them to connect to what we're doing. And now this is a naive perspective, but it is something that I want to explore and understand better. Aspirationally, what I think we'd like to achieve is to make sure this land is producing as much, if not more, calories for humans to eat than it was before. Now, it's really complicated and hard to calculate because before it was mainly taken for silage, and of course then that goes to feed livestock, and then livestock, then it depends what kind of livestock, and then you have to try and calculate how many calories that silage added to the livestock protein that is produced or calories it produce, and then we've got to work out how much we're producing and try and work it out. But so it's complicated is the answer. However, that's something that, a bit of research that we would like to do because it's important. Can we take this land? Can we restore nature to it? Can we produce as much, if not more, quality calories from what we're doing, and engage corporates and employ more people? And that's all part of this, hopefully, vision we're going to do.
And inspire young people to learn about where their food come from, how they can grow it. The lovely thing about vegetable growing is all you need is a meter squared, and you can actually produce quite a lot of food. So let's get that as part of our conversation. And I'm conscious we've been talking for a little while. I don't want to take away from this amazing interview with Matt, but just as a final point, what I'm particularly excited about with the orchard is it's not only the food production element of it, and we're going to be using some wonderful heritage varieties of apples and plums and cherries, and that really connect in with the legacy of Monmouthshire. But also what's amazing about an orchard is its fantastic biodiversity benefits. And I'm sure at some point we'll probably do a whole episode around the biodiversity function of an ancient orchard.
I mean, I don't know anything about that, so I'm looking forward to that. Right, should we go into the chat?
Yes.
Well, a man that needs very little introduction. He will do all the talking for himself. Very charismatic, very inspirational. And it starts with a wonderful story about meeting a random person in a pub that helps him create his dream. Here he is.
So, hello, Matt, and welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Hello, Chloe. Hello, Tom. It's really exciting to be here.
Well, this conversation has been a long time in the organising, and I'm really excited to get into the story of Henbant, and I'm particularly interested in this concept of agri-wilding. But before we step into the conversation, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and Henbant to the listeners.
So I'm Matt, and I'm lucky enough to be a farmer up here between the mountains and the sea in northwest Wales. We kind of found ourselves this really amazing little beautiful corner, really. And here with my family, my wife Jenny, and a team actually of people, we're farming, and we're tending this bit of land anyway. And Henbant is 80 acres. It was a former quarry, so it was kind of gravel quarry in the 60s. And when they created that quarry, they basically boarded up the whole house, and it got forgotten. It just kind of got, left alone, and all the roofs fell in. And about 12 years ago, we found it. And we were on this mission, really Jenny and I were on this mission to find a nest, really. We wanted somewhere to build a nest, somewhere to grow babies and cabbages, it was just it was quite a romantic little thing we wanted to set out for. That's worked beautifully. But then really quickly, I realized how important farming is. And so we developed this question, which is it possible to buy a small farm on a mortgage? We really didn't have deep pockets. We'd just fallen in love with this place. And then we met this bloke in a pub in Bristol who said, look, I can make this work for you. But yeah, so is it possible to buy a small farm on a mortgage, to make it pay its way through producing really good nutrient-dense food? At the same time, can we build soil, build biodiversity, build social capital? So can we bring a community with it? And I think this is the most important bit. Can we enjoy it at the same time? And I think that for us is this it's kind of like our core question is it possible to do the things we're doing, but can we do it in a way that's replicable, and can we do it in a way that's genuinely enjoyable?
No, meeting a chap in a pub in Bristol doesn't sound dodgy at all. So that sounds completely legitimate. I think there's a bit of the story that you haven't quite touched on, or at least I'd like to know, is what is your background? I mean, you've gone from, we bought a farm, this is our mission, but where have you come from, and are you from farming stock?
No, I'm not from farming stock at all. I grew up, I was desperate to be a farmer when I grew up. So if you ever come across John Seymour, it's this guy who, I don't know when it must have been in the 50s, 60s, I guess, really, moved to West Wales and basically wrote all these amazing books on self-sufficiency. And he writes in this amazing way, which is me and you think this and they think that. And he writes in this way that brings you alongside him. And he creates this romantic picture of what humans should do and how we should relate to a landscape. And it's just amazing. But I found this book when I was 10, which was a bit odd in a way. And it became this almost like a Bible's probably the wrong word to use, but it's the core text of my childhood. But I grew up in a terrace house near Leeds. So farming just felt so far away from us. So I did things like I built a harness for my sister and I hatched out chickens like secretly underneath my bed. And I had an amazing time trying to be a farmer, but it just wasn't possible. And so I went off and I became an ecologist. I've always had this like deep love really for nature and the natural world and that space. And so I went off and became an ecologist. And then I went and did a PhD on penguin and seal behavior. I basically always loved really extreme places. Like I love those like wet, windy hillsides, which is maybe why I've ended up here. But yeah, I did that for a while. And that was like this kind of like deep investigation into how do ecosystems work. But then I really wanted to see different ecosystems. And so I jumped into filmmaking. And I remember like doing a PhD, to be honest, it's pretty, well, mine was, I found quite boring. But as I got towards the end of it, I just started like dreaming off into what comes next. And I started watching these natural history films. I was like, oh, I'm desperate to do this. So I went off and became a natural history filmmaker. And I spent like a year or two just carrying people's bags and making cups of tea. And I ended up making cups of tea for a series called Planet Earth. And I kind of then got involved in that team. And I spent like a decade really making films and natural history unit and made programs like Life and Frozen Planet was probably the biggest series I worked on. And that was incredible for like adventure, but it's not very good for domestic bliss. And you'll know about this, Tom. Maybe you'll know about this, Chloe. But I remember when we were doing this, everyone was like, oh, don't worry, Jenny. It's just like being an army wife. And Jen was like, whoa. Like, I never signed up to be an army wife. And so we really had to stop. And also we got to the end of Frozen Planet. And when making that, we got to spend just like a long time in really what look like perfect ecosystems, but actually they're really not. They're really changing. They're really eroding. I spent a lot of time with like Inuit communities, and they were saying how things are changing so dramatically every year. And so we put all these things into Frozen Planet. Like you've got a whole team of people who really care. But then you come out at the other end and then like Discovery Channel go, well, wait a minute. I'm not really sure our advertisers really want to say so much about climate change and on all these things that, you know, that we were all worried about. So I thought, you know what? There was no one around me who had a really healthy home life. And then I was doing things that were just being kind of centered anyway. So I loved it, but I really wanted to just stop and become part of an ecosystem. That's when that kind of drive to nest came in.
I think the concept of nest is a really interesting one because it has so many connotations in terms of cuddling and safe and secure and home, but also I love the connections with the natural metaphor. And I suppose I wonder whether Jenny and you had the same vision for your nest and whether that was having been through the journey with Tom, where we had to work out what our nest was going to be, whether you had a kind of shared value set when you arrived in North Wales or whether there was a difference in perspective.
To be honest, I think we did. Like, I think people are often quite surprised that Henbant's bigger than we ever intended it to be. And we're doing more things than we ever really meant to do. But actually, there was this amazing moment where we were both sat in Bristol and Jenny was like, look, ever since I've known you, you wanted to do this thing. What are you doing? Let's just go do it. I think somehow like it's probably my underlying dream and energy, but Jenny's always really, really been on board. And maybe we'll talk about it later in the podcast, but like there's this thing as holistic decision making, which has become a really core part of how we work and what we work. And at least from that perspective, it's just a really nice way of having like a shared vision. Yeah.
So take us through the story. Let's take us back to the start. So you bought this old quarry. It doesn't sound much like a farm, I'm going to be honest, right? The way you've described it so far, with a falling down house. So just, you know, what was the steps and processes you've gone through to take it to where it is today?
Well, like the first bit was pretty slow. So like really, you know, like we kind of turned up and we'd spent a long time because we were going to do One Planet Development, which is this Welsh government policy for enabling more people to be useful, I guess, in the countryside in a way. And we really wanted to do that. But then when we were doing that, we met all these people and like years and years into their projects, they were still just like living in caravans. And I was like, okay, we've got 48 hours, fix up this old caravan. We went to buy, because with Henbant, we'd bought, like a lake sounds really pretentious, but we'd bought this like massive pond anyway. And I was like, well, let's get a little sailing dinghy. So we found this secondhand sailing dinghy. But when we went to buy it, it was next to this old caravan. And I was like, look, do you want this static caravan? He was like, oh no, you can have it for free if you move it. I didn't know anything about caravans. And like, actually, for like 600 quid, I could have got like one with like double glazing, and we bought the wrong caravan. But we bought this caravan and it cost us like £1,000 to move it here. So it's definitely not the right caravan. But I was like, right, we've got one weekend to fix this up. And so we started like that. And we didn't have any electric for like 6 months when we first started. And, you know, like we had this moment of time when the whole farm froze up. And Jenny wrote this in because she was just like super pregnant. She was like, going to give birth at any minute. And we still had no electric. And so Jenny wrote this email about pregnant lady in freezing field in Wales, like whatever. And then the next day in this massive storm, there were like 20 Land Rovers appeared over the hill. And there were all these like Scottish Power people came and just brought us electric. But they were like, we're not allowed to work on a day like today, but we've all had the story. And so we're bringing electric. They went from there. And before we came here, I don't know, I've always liked bodging things really. But we started with a house. So I was like, right, let's just put a roof on the house. Let's just go for those basics. And that was like the first year really. I remember racing back from the hospital when we had Nell, our first baby. And like in between, and I was like, first of all, I was like, I'm not leaving the hospital. I'm going to stay with my child. But nurses have got this amazing capacity. I'm like, no, actually, you will go home. Oh yeah, I will go home. And anyway, I came back and like fitted a stove, and then went back to get the baby. So it was like really on the edge of possible. But then bit by bit, we've just built up. And what's been fun with Henbant is we've never really had any money. Like I said, like we borrowed a lot of money to start with, and we had, I don't know, maybe we had like £5,000 or something in the account after we bought Henbant. And we've never really had any more, but nor have we really had any less. Like we've just managed to kind of keep reinvesting and really kind of building the project from there.
So if someone were to arrive at Henbant, what would they see? What's the landscape like? What are the ecosystems that you've got there? Yeah, I mean, what is this quarry?
Yeah, so the landscape here is super mixed. So there was the house, and there's like 20 acres of land around the house, which was like just ranched for sheep, really. It was just like extensively grazed for sheep. And then we have got about 20 acres of like wet willow, like from where the quarry was. It's actually created these amazing like water retaining landscapes, like from a permaculture or from a rewilding perspective, like you couldn't have like a richer, more diverse landscape. And then we had about 20 acres of Sitka spruce. We've got these big ponds, and then we've got this really beautiful, like where they kind of dumped all because it was a sand and gravel quarry, so it's pretty benign. But basically they just dumped all these big piles like sand and stone and whatever it is up there. And it's created this little like fairyland, really. And what I'm going for across the whole thing, and it's coming. So when you come to Henbant, like you've got these views, but then you've got these little orchards and stuff and all these little agroforestry. Like we basically covered the whole thing in trees, and mainly quite productive trees. And they just kind of lead you down to like the kind of hub of the farm. And the farm is quite I don't know. In some ways, I feel like all I've done since we came is make a mess. But then in other ways, I feel like bit by bit, it's kind of starting to come back together. And the farmyard itself is like small and traditional and kind of beautiful.
And one of the debates that I'm curious about within this world of farming and nature is how you define the approach that you're taking. So people talk about regenerative agriculture, they talk about permaculture, they talk about organic. You talk about agri-wilding. I suppose I'm really interested in how you would describe the approach that you take at Henbant and what's informed that journey.
Yeah, I think it's evolved. Like, so when we came, like I'd just done a permaculture design course, and we had this like, right, we're going to be a permaculture farm. And it's a label we still really use. There's a really nice word in Welsh, which is like paramethi, which basically means forever nurturing, which is like kind of a better description of permaculture of itself than you could have with anything else. So we came with that setting, and then really quickly, we kind of moved into this, like, because permaculture's got this phrase, hasn't it? So permaculture, for those who don't know about it really, to me, it means lots of different things to different people. But I think to me, it kind of means just copying nature. Like, can we do things in nature's image, or how would nature farm? And that's what we've always wanted to do. But there's a reason as well that conventional farming is as it is, because I think it's really easy to go bonkers. Permaculture encourages you to tie all these different things together and try and get everything working at once and get all these, like, you know, every single thing should have 3 functions and this crazy dance. And there's a permaculture saying, which is like the only limit to a farmer's productivity is a farmer's imagination. I took that and I was like, right, great, this is what we're going to do. But then really quickly you go bonkers. And then we've stepped quite quickly into holistic decision making. And this is a really useful tool for us, which is basically just going, well, stop. What do you really, really want out of life? And therefore, what do you really, really want out of this piece of land? And therefore, how do we do that? And it just takes all the assumptions off you. Because if you land on a farm, and I'm sure you guys have had this, you land, and also everyone assumes that you're going to do A, B, C, D. And it's really easy. And I see it with a lot of people I work with. They just fall into this space of, okay, well, we need to do that, and we've got to have that. And I think holistic decision making just stops all that assumption of what you're going to do and just kind of pauses that while you work out what you actually want. And then you can bring in some of those elements will be accurate and some won't. And then we fell into regenerative agriculture. I've taken a really long way around this. But then I really fell into regenerative agriculture. And I was like, look at this. Like, if we can make the world better through producing food, like that is amazingly strong, isn't it? Like that's world changing. Like there's almost no excuse to do anything else. But then we got like, 5 years maybe into this journey. And I was like, well, actually, this is pretty hard work. can I really pay a mortgage to like cabbages? And these chickens, they've all stopped laying eggs. And this apple tree, well, that ain't going to produce apple juice to fill a shop, is it? I had this moment of like, is this really true? But then I went on this little journey around Europe and I went off to visit places who were doing this. And this space is, I think what you have to understand now is this space has evolved really fast over the last decade. And so 5 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, like there were like a tiny handful of spaces around Europe that were saying, well, we're small. So I wanted something that matched our context. I basically went off to visit farms that were small, that were really producing food and that were enjoying it and had some kind of like nature enrichment or really kind of diverse, thriving ecosystem kind of side going on. And what was interesting is I found a tiny handful, like really not many, but the ones I did visit were really good. Like they were really successful. And you've got these little islands of people who are really enjoying what they're doing. They're thriving. And then all the neighbors are just doing the same thing they've always done. And I found that quite confusing, but I also found it reassuring that it was possible. And so I kind of came back and jumped into it. And I think since then, I think regenerative agriculture is going off on a little bit of it's been taken over by the industry, by a bigger kind of farming industry. And I think it's been simplified, which maybe is not bad, but it started to basically just mean that it's soil building or it's water retaining or it's carbon sequestering. But it's a really simple matrix. And is that really regenerative? So I love this thing in regenerative. Like Chloe, if you asked Tom how your relationship was and Tom came back and went, oh, it's sustainable, that's not very good, is it? You know, like I want a relationship that gets stronger all the time. And to me, that's what regenerative means. And I think it's perfectly possible to design a system well, where everything gets better all the time. It's just a bit like there's no such thing as static in nature, is there? Like it never just goes along at the same level. It's either getting worse or it's getting better. It's either getting richer or poorer. And I think with good design, we can design for positivity. I now think that good end of that has kind of been taken over by agroecology. And I think agroecology is a really beautiful term for doing that kind of holistic pie of everything at the same time. And it's got a social element and it's got a real kind of human element and a biodiversity element and a shared knowledge over it. Like it's a really beautiful thing, actually, agroecology. But to me, that word regenerative is so strong as a concept that I'm kind of holding on to that for now. And then once I'd kind of proved that had worked, like my brain's, I don't know, maybe it's not that fast, but it does get bored. And so there came a point a few years ago and I was like, well, look, this is great. Like regenerative agriculture just works. And then I started to go, like, I'm an ecologist and we're incredibly fortunate to have this little half side of a valley. And wouldn't it just be nice to really see the nature element of that thrive? And I went off on this journey to see if it's possible to really produce things for human needs, but also at the same time to really boost biodiversity and really have a thriving ecosystem. And I kind of started going, there's no compromise between them. I was on the board of Nature Friendly Farming Network, a really amazing network of people who are doing far more powerful things. They're doing really good, but they created this concept called maximum sustainable output. And that's this idea that basically there's a point in the middle, which is optimal between inputs and outputs. So that's one approach to it. And I was like, no, this doesn't exist. Like we can have both at the same time. What I think I've now realized is actually at some point that does exist. Like there is. I think of it like a massive swingometer almost between productivity and nature enrichment. And what I've realized is that there is an arm that goes between the two. But if you've got a really strong ecosystem, then you can get loads out of it. It's like the whole thing is amplifying. And I think, you talked about on this podcast a few times, like there's such a big sense of we can't remember what our ecosystems used to look like. There's this eroding baseline. Mm-hmm. And I think we used to have like one woolly mammoth to every 2 hectares or something. Like we used to live in an incredibly rich ecosystem. And if you can bring that back to where we are now and think there's no reason this ecosystem can't be so productive again. And then with good design, we can bring in both these elements. And there is a compromise between the two. But with good design, the whole thing can be incredibly productive and incredibly healthy. And that to me is kind of what Agriwilding is really kind of exploring that space of. We're running this course next year and we're working a lot with a guy called Mark Shepherd who came up with, he kind of went through the same route and he was like, okay, well, look, there's like, he called it farm scale permaculture. And then he went on and he called it restoration agriculture. But I think to me, this agri-wilding for us is a really sweet spot.
Listeners will appreciate that this is music to our ears. This all makes absolute sense and sounds sensible. Now, to put my traditional farmer's hat on, not that I've got one or that they give me one, but their question will be, but do you really produce an appropriate amount of food? What about food security? So I'd just like to hear a bit more about what is coming off the land and what how you've seen the production rise or fall.
Yeah, sure. It's really easy. So where we sit, I can now walk around Henbant and I can say, look, our little bit of land that we're responsible for is producing more food. It's got richer biodiversity. It's producing more income. It's producing more jobs than any of the farms or land around us, at least definitely on a kind of like scale, like a size of our farm. Maybe if we were next to a really super productive dairy farm down on the coast somewhere, maybe if we were in an arable field in Lincolnshire, I couldn't say that. But certainly for where we are, for the kind of land type we've got, we're definitely producing more. Am I producing more beef per acre than our neighbours? Probably not, really. Like, I think the way we're doing things, like conventional, is a very productive way of producing whatever that crop is they're producing. But because we've got lots of different layers of systems across Henbant, the total amount of food we produce is huge, actually, in comparison. And a big part of that is the market garden. So down next to the farm itself, we've got, it's like an acre. It's now kind of an acre and a half, to be honest. But we've got this acre of land and it's very slightly north facing. You can see the mountains, you can see the sea, like it's suboptimal in nearly all dimensions. But that produces enough veg to feed 80 families, most of their veg, for most of the year. Not all of it, but like honestly, like there's a huge amount of food comes out of it. And then we currently produce as much beef as we can get our local abattoir to give us space to process. A limiting factor on that is really good abattoir that can actually do a good job of it. I was like vegetarian from like 4 to 25. And so we only eat our own meat. And it's really important to us that what we do has got a genuine, like an authenticity to it, really. So there are other limiting factors that come into play around it. And then we've got the chickens as well. So we've got 300 hens and we feed a few cafes and they all go into those veg box and those kind of families that we feed. So I don't know if I've really quantified it as well as I could do, but I just know that our turnover from food on the farm is much bigger than the equivalent would be somewhere else.
Earlier, Matt, you mentioned about agroforestry, and that might be a concept that's new to some of our listeners. So I wonder if you could define what that means to you and why it feels like it's an important part of your system.
Sure. I genuinely do think that agroforestry is going to become like one of those kind of core changes that runs right through conventional agriculture, that runs right through just when we look back in 50 years at these moments in the ways we farm. I think bringing trees into the landscape, I know there's currently a little bit of resistance, but bringing trees into landscape is going to be a really powerful thing that we change to do. And so agroforestry to me, I think, is like the intentional use of trees in a farm landscape. Okay. So they bring all sorts of benefits. They bring in shade, they bring in shelter, they bring in extra forage for livestock. Reducing the wind speed through a farm brings huge benefits. And I think one of the other things is I think a lot of people have always been like scared of shade. And I think if you look at actually like often grass can go better in the shade at the side of your thing. Like when we found Henbant, I was like, first of all, I was a bit scared of shade. And I was like, well, wait a minute, look, in the growing season, the sun goes over the top. Like you don't get so much shade in the main growing season. And then I was really scared of weeds. And then I've been like, oh no, it's interesting. I can read what they're doing. And now I'm like, just bring them all on. Like I just want as many weeds as possible on my farm. I'm a bit conscious that could go too far. But there's somewhere I'm enjoying that going. I think if you went back 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, like the place to hang out would have been that woodland edge. Like we talk about this landscape we're trying to create or recreate. And it was a mosaic landscape, wasn't it? Like it is this kind of like patchy kind of glade and woodland system. And in that system, the place where the berry grows, the place where the fruit grows, the place where the nut grows, where the mushrooms, those edible mushrooms, they all on that woodland edge. And so for me, trying to create as much woodland edge as possible across the whole farm just seems like a really beautiful way of farming. And it seems like the obvious thing to do. Like, let's farm in nature's image. And so what I want to do with Henbant, and we're working towards it, I'm currently on about 40, but I want to go to about 100. Is I want to create like 100 forest glades across the whole farm. And these would be like pasture. They'd be like proper pasture. And then within each bit of pasture, or most of the pasture, there'd be a wet bit that was intentionally designed to hold a bit of water. Maybe there'd be like a little pile of rocks, or there'd be kind of scruffy edges. But they would be good pasture for animals to graze on. And then around that, there'd be lines of trees, just kind of narrow rows, maybe 3 meters, something like that. I started off coming in and just putting like 1 meter rows. I was like, oh no, we'll leave loads of pasture. What a ridiculous thing to be doing. Like as I'm going on, like I'm just giving more and more space into trees. But I do want the pasture as well. So we'll have 100 forest glades. And then around that, I can move my cattle, or I can move the chickens, or whatever else it is. I can move them around that system such that with 100 of them, I only come back like 3.5 times a year. And that gives those spaces loads of time to really shine. It gives all those plants time to fully go through to seed, to fully like just express themselves. But it also enables me to create quite a lot of beef and also to kind of take a crop for humans out of that system.
Listeners will know that I love anything entrepreneurial, or even just saying the word, it gets me excited. But again, with my nice farmer hat on, having the ability or the entrepreneurial flair to try new ideas and take risks is okay if the land is making money. And farming, as we've been told, I'm not a farmer, but as being told, is extremely hard to generate revenue, and therefore my understanding is that's why they're doing it the old ways, because that's why they know works, inverted commas. That's how they know they get their grants from the government. So I'm really keen to just dig a little bit further into, you mentioned you bought it on a mortgage, and there'll be a lot of listeners to the podcast going, this is my dream. And you're telling me I can do this on a mortgage and it can work. Isn't this great? So would you mind just taking us through in as much detail or little, again, as you feel comfortable, like how you've managed to make it work?
Yeah, sure. I think we made it work, well, partly just by doing things really badly for quite a long time. Like, we've gone round and replaced like half the gates in the farm. Like the first gate was a pallet and the second gate was maybe an attractive but knackered old piece of wood. And now we've actually just got a gate like any other normal farm. So part of it is just building things slowly and making sure we've always had this rule that like whatever we spend, like unless there's a really good reason not, we can only spend things on things that make the money back in a year. And we're now in a position where it can take a few years to pay back, but things really need to pay back into the system. In terms of taking risks, I think it's one thing where, like when I grew up, I was like, oh, why can't my dad be a farmer? Like this is rubbish. I'm going to have to buy this farm and all these, like, I've now realized how lucky I am actually to be able to come in and just design the farm from, you never design from scratch because humans have lived here for thousands of years, don't they? So there is a pattern on the landscape, but to come in and see that pattern and see what I want out of it, like freshly, and I've got nothing to risk. So I think if you've inherited a farm or you're taking over from your parents on the farm and you're the person who makes a change, then you're the one who lost the farm. Even if you're doing something that is probably not the best thing to do, then you're trapped, aren't you? Maybe trapped because you invested a fortune in a big silly chicken shed. Or maybe you're trapped because, you've got the infrastructure to work in a certain pattern and then you're in a really tight margin forevermore. I think the biggest risk really is people just get stuck because if they were told to do something this way by their, and these are in situations where it's like a granddad or a great granddad said, well, look, the pattern looks like this. And you change it and you take that risk on board and then you lose the farm, then it's all on your head, isn't it? And I think that's really, I can't imagine being in that situation. That must be really hard. For me, I'd taken all the risk already. Like we were just here. We did. So it's completely right to say that we've never really tried to just pay the farm through food. Like what's been important to us is produce really good food in a way that is profitable or produce food in a way that at least pays its way. So all our enterprises do pay at least minimum wage for the time put into them, right? That's about as good as they get. Now, if you think about that against, at least in Wales, like 67% of farm income comes through subsidies. So it's doing better than that by quite a long way already. But it's never going to make you rich. It's never going to really take risks, And that's the thing is we've set up quite a big tourism side of the business. So we initially came on and we were like Henbant's really beautiful. And so every night we'd come down over the hill and the sun had set, but we had to go inside because the kids need watering and the things need, like there's all these jobs, aren't there? There's like real life.
I love that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So we were like, well, wait a minute, there's this beautiful sunset and no one's harvesting it. And also we were like, well, so he said, we'll just open a campsite. And we just said, no, we're just going to build a campsite. And I just advertised it. And I'm a big believer in if you say something, then you just get on with making it true. And so I put this advert out for a campsite and then we went to the shops and then this lady phoned up and said, oh, we're going to be there in like 3 hours to the campsite. I said, oh, I'm just going to get, so we raced home. We made like a little toilet block and it was pretty extreme. But that toilet lasted for like 5 years. And I apologized to everybody who came and had to use that toilet. But what we've done is we basically built a tourist side of the business. And then we've also realized that, well, at first, so we built this tourism side of the business. And I was like, no, I came to be a farmer. Farmers produce money through food. And Jenny was like, yeah, that's fine. But you've taken on this massive mortgage. So you need to talk to me about that. So I was like, okay, well, let's bring the people in. That's lovely. I love people. And what I've realized is that the countryside just needs more people. It's one of the major barriers to making a beautiful future. But then there's people who come, they really enjoy it. And what we try to create is like this don't know about you. I suspect you did. When you were little, like you fell in love with that, like, this is not so cool, like Enid Blyton, no, Swallows and Amazon, romantic kind of adventure, you know? And so I really wanted a space where kids can come down to the garden and they can pick some vegetables and they can milk a cow and they can collect some eggs and they can go in the woods and they can get lost and meet some smugglers and find a cave. And, you know, like all these things that are important to childhood. And also, I think if you've got a lot of adults, then if adults wake up and hear a dawn chorus, I think that just ends up in a better world. And so actually, I think having people on the farm, I've gone from, I just want to grow cabbages, to actually people are the most important thing we do on the farm. And that does make income. And that's allowed us to take risks. And it's enabled me to go, look, because there's not been any grants for anything we've done. It's quite a big expense to cover the trees and all these cover the farm in all these agroforestry systems. But actually, I think this is where it's interesting. I do think they're all paying their way back and they are bringing back the income. It's just a big risk and it's just carrying the risk of it, where the human elements, that tourism side, and now this kind of teaching side of the farm allows us to carry the risk.
It's such a beautiful image for you're painting that with your words. And I think what you're talking about for me, it's, although some people might say, oh, it's kind of idealistic, what is really true from my perspective is actually what you're talking about is really grounded in research. So we know that people connecting with nature is great for their well-being, for their physical health, for their creativity, and children playing without adult supervision in the outdoors is amazing for their development. So there's empirical research that backs up all of that, all those stories really. It's so lovely to hear that in action. And I wonder about how else you're bringing people to the landscape. So you talked about the tourism element, but I know that you contribute to the community in many ways. And I wonder whether you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, an essential part of the plan was always to bring people in. But what we didn't realize is a few years ago, well, when we came to farm, we had this massive, really broken, like wriggly tin shed. And it was really dangerous. Every time the wind blew, I was like, okay, nobody go near the shed. And then the vet came and we had a cow in this, go near the shed. And he said, oh, he's like 30 years ago, he came to the shed and it was really dangerous then. I was like, okay, we need to do something about the shed. So we took it down. We built a big timber frame barn. It's really beautiful, but my intention was really, we'd have a little meeting space on one end, and then we'd have the rest of the barn for cows. And people would sit in this little box at one end and have a little office. And I love this idea that people can have like meaningful meetings and conversations in a positive space. So that's what I was trying to create. But then we were like, oh, look, well, we need another bay of the barn for people. And like the cows can go over there. And then we'll have another bay. And then I was like, wait a minute, the cows can just live in the woods. Like, we're just going to use the whole space. So we've started doing like film nights and music nights and story nights and things like this. We use it as a space for meetings. Like, there's amazing meetings. Like, all the leaders of all the NGOs in Wales all came for this like secret little supper, you know? And like, it really does bring people in at all different scales. So it means we can run courses where bring people from all over the world. It means we can bring in people who are trying to, you guys are doing this, you know all about this, you're creating these spaces yourselves. But it's a really good thing to do because then you create people come in and they do have a conversation in a positive space and things happen. But then also just having a party for the village, you know, and just it means like at least once a month, 2-3 times a month, quite often, we can have like 100 people from our local community that just come together. And like, I don't know, like the village hall, I think it'll come back for us. You know, I'm a believer in just doing. And in a way, we've kind of created our own village hall with a narrative of what a beautiful world we can create if we try. And then there's people through the whole system. So we then started with volunteers near the start. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, like, how's this person ever going to break this loop of having no money in volunteering? Like, this is a bit of a dangerous space to be entering into. But that has changed radically over the time we're here. So now we can offer people like an internship and we can give people like, say someone comes to us, they spend a summer with us and they can get access to all our training that we provide, which is really valuable and really good. And they can go out and actually what's been interesting is the last 2 years, everyone who's come to us on those trainings has left into paid work. Those who want to have left into paid work in this space. Like, there's a massive mushroom of demand for farmers and rewilders, or just people who can say, look, I can do this. And so I'm trying to create people who say I can do this. And that's a big element of it. I don't know. I got a bit lost, Chloe.
I mean, I think it's a lovely response.
We do say this quite a lot on our interviews that we are basically going to jump in the car and come and visit. But this is one that I really feel strongly about coming to visit. I just think you're way ahead of us in a lot of the stuff you're doing. And it'd be great to come and to see it in action and understand and be part of the journey would be really, really exciting. One of the things we haven't yet touched upon, and I'm just generally interested, probably because I want to come on them, is what are the courses that you run and how's that offering evolved over time?
Yeah. Well, we started off, we came, and I was all into permaculture. So we ran a permaculture design course and we ran a few introduction to permaculture design courses. But really quickly, I came into this space of going, I don't know, I feel like I've been lucky enough to have this little like vision of what can be, and it's my own and it's biased. And, you know, I'm definitely not saying it's the best thing. But in my head, there's this little possible, more beautiful world. So I wanted to create like a set of trainings that like honors that and allows people to train to live in a more beautiful world. So in that, there's a set of like craft courses and there's a set of permaculture courses and there's all these other ones. But what I really want to do is create a syllabus that really enables people to be useful in that space. And so we start with children. So we've got a forest school and we've got a farm school, and really kind of, I want to start that training at like 3 or 4, something like that. And we're creating a syllabus for that. But then that's really quickly goes through to teenagers and through to adults. And then our adults training courses are, a few years ago, we got Richard Perkins to come and teach these like regenerative farm design courses. It's a really beautiful approach. And what we do is over 9 days, we go really deep into how does an ecosystem actually work? It's similar to the stuff I've spoken about really. So what we do is we go, look, let's take all the assumptions away. How does a system really, really work? Like what is a water cycle? What is photosynthesis? How, you know, what did a landscape used to look like 20,000 years ago? Where did agriculture go wrong? All these little things. And then we build that into, we go deep into holistic decision making. And what do you really, I think holistic decision making is actually going to be the future of this world. Because I think just what do you want out of your farm anyway? And helping people to design that process. And then we go through really, how do those different elements of a farm, of the things that we actually eat, how does that actually look in this context? And then really looking at kind of like business planning and stuff like that to really kind of make it work for those people. I recognize, like, as you love, Tom, that there really is a set of numbers that are essential to this as well. And we go quite deep into that. And so we've run that for quite a few years and it's a really good course. But then I did the rewilding training. You've had it on the podcast at Embercombe a couple of years ago. And that's just a really accessible, good way of running a training. And also, I love the fact it brings all these different experts. Like if you love Richard Perkins, then our Richard Perkins course is amazing. But if you want to hear from all different leaders and experts and different things, I wanted to create a training of all the people who we've learned from and we've been inspired by in our journey. And I went off to more. And so I said, hey, look, will you come and be on this course with us? Like, we think you're amazing. And they all said yes. I didn't think like half of them would, but they've all said, yeah, we'd love to be involved. And I think it's the first training of its type. So this is like online. So every Monday night in term time, people sign in, they get, we do an hour with whoever is the best person in the world at this. And we've got a conversation afterwards, but we've still got lots of in-person time as well. So over the course, I think you do 11 days over 3 weekends at Henbant to really get your fingers dirty and really get to know a cohort of people. And then around that, we're building lots of kind of short courses like craft courses and art courses. And there's a big part of the future world, which is also it's about ceremony, actually. And it's about spirituality. And I think, like, you had Ray Banerjee on before, and I think that taking that holistic approach, and that's part of Henbant, is going to actually, there is this full radius of different things that we need to touch on for something to work. And I think next, moving into that space of ceremony and nature connection and really deeply listening and building a relationship with land is also a core part, in some of it quite subtle, but is a core part of all the training we're going to offer. Yeah.
That completely resonates for me. I've been really thinking about this idea of ceremony and community and how we've lost a lot of those. It almost feels like a lot of our ceremonies have been overtaken by commercialism as opposed to actually what they really should be about, which is connection with people, connection with place, connection with nature. So I expect there's a whole other podcast we could touch on around that subject, but I'm conscious of the time. And I just wanted to say how much I really appreciate, Matt, this can-do attitude that you bring to any problem, and this idea of when you talk about something, you make it happen. And maybe in the risk of asking a dangerous question, where do you see Henbant in 10 years? What if things have developed, and maybe this is an impossible question because of how things do develop so organically, but what would the vision be?
I don't know. I think to me, this idea of having a whole productive landscape. So we have 100 glades, and each of those glades is all productive and beautiful. There'll be a general pattern that looks similar, but they'll all be super productive. And then at the middle of that, we've got these little hobbit houses that we're developing, and we've got hobbit houses is not quite the right word, but lovely little cabins anyway. Mm-hmm. We've got a nice space for people to come and spend time in nature. And then we've got the core of it, which is really feeding the community, and we've got this community hub. So we've got all the elements of that are kind of laid out, but they're getting better as time goes on. And also, I think we came into this year going, actually, for Henbant to be successful, we've got to take ourselves out of the core center of it. Like there's a Dutch saying, isn't there? And it's like, I can't talk Dutch, so I won't say it in Dutch. But there's a Dutch saying which basically says, by yourself, you can go fast, but together you can go further. And I think that's a core part of what we're trying to do at Henbant this year. So really trying to properly make these paid roles. And now we've got 4 people actually taking like salaries out of the farm, plus me and Jenny. So paying for those central roles, but also getting them so that people feel like they're really safe here and they can be here for a long time, and making the decision-making processes and stuff that we've got at the farm more shared out. There's still a little bit of this like central vision that we kind of run away with in the middle. And I love being able to just make decisions that potentially are wrong, because I think it enables us to still do things that are different and that are a bit cheeky and that are maybe, allow us to respond to things. But we've also got this core of businesses that allow us to actually, we've got an amazing lady who runs all our forest school, runs all our children's education stuff. She's like a real person. She's got a mortgage, she's got a house, she's got children, and it's working really well with that. And we've got a guy called Dan who we've brought in. We now run this Mice, which is this like cooperative to sell really good food locally that we've now kind of taken on. And he's running that and it pays for him. And bit by bit, just try to bring other people into the cluster whose lives and purpose is kind of underneath the Henbant umbrella, such that we make ourselves, it's not all about us. It's about a beautiful team that believe that a more beautiful world is possible, but that really feel that they can make that come true. They can actually take action and actually do things, and it'll actually work.
What a point to finish on, Matt. I've so enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure many of our listeners will be thinking about, well, where do I go to find out more? Where would you signpost people to?
Just come to the website. I love it if people follow me on Instagram, but I probably shouldn't. And it's but really just come to the Henbant website. So henbant.org, and just go from there. Thank you, both of you two. I've loved watching your journey develop, and I was like, oh, look at this! Look, there's 2 nice people who've come to Wales on whatever it is, 80 acres. Is it similar size anyway? On a really similar mission, but like whatever it is, 10 years not behind, but 10 years on a different path, because the world has moved in the meantime. And I wonder sometimes if I came into this now, would we just go rewilding instead of agri-wilding or farming? Maybe we would. Anyway, I've loved watching and hearing your journey.
No, I think everyone, I was literally reflecting on the same thing as you were talking. And I think that we are informed by our past experiences, our past passions and specialisms. And I think that's what will more likely influence and impact the direction of the Grange projects going forward, like it's impacted you and your project. So I think that's, we will be going on a slightly different direction. But I think what's nice about it is that we will have the similar intentions and want to have an impact in a positive way in our own special ways. So when are we going to visit?
I'm looking at the diary right now. I have so many reflections from this conversation. I just counted my list. I have 8 points. We're not going to be able to cover 8 points. There was just so much richness and inspiration. And I just want to underline this perspective he holds on how we're going to create this beautiful world. And I loved his poetic language in describing the vision that they have at Henbant, and perhaps even what he started with, which was that question: can you farm on a mortgage and produce something that's wonderful for your family, for the place, for food production locally, for nature? And I think he's starting to answer that question.
Yeah, and the answer is not as black and white as, well, yes, you can, because actually what struck me was the diversification, which without fail comes through every single one of our conversations about similar topics. If you just sat down and ran it as a farm, then what we're seeing is that would be extremely challenging to maintain, even a basic quality of kind of life as a farmer. But what it's had to do through necessity, through need to pay the mortgage, and through reaching more people is diversify into other streams of revenue generation. And that's, again, it's a theme that keeps cropping up.
And I think what was really interesting there is how he connected that into risk, how the diversification of the business has enabled him to take more risk, to be more entrepreneurial in his approach. And that has allowed him to move out of a conventional system into something more complex, but perhaps meeting more needs.
The thing that struck me was the example he gives about if you come from a farming family and you're the one that takes a risk. And I just felt that was really insightful and useful for the non-farmers like you and I to try and better understand our neighbours and the challenges facing farming as a whole.
And another idea that I really appreciated and will return to was this idea of holistic decision making. I think when you think about it, it feels quite obvious. Like when you make a decision, you have to consider lots of factors. But actually, it's not just considering the factors that are maybe physically in front of you in terms of when I plant this tree, what impact will it have on the ecosystem? But actually, when I plant this tree, what does this mean to us as a family? What does this mean to the people that come and visit Henbant? What does this mean to the cows? What does this mean to the ecosystem and nature? So holding the complexity in that decision-making process. But what you need alongside that is the clarity of vision. And my sense from speaking to Matt and in his conversations with Jenny, they've developed a really clear vision of the principles they're trying to work towards with the farm. And I love their journey of permaculture, regenerative agriculture, agri-wilding, and it just shows how you can be fluid in your approach when it's connected to a value-led vision.
That's a lot of psychology speak, I think, there. I was trying to follow it. Yes, I think what I took from holistic decision making was work out what you want to get out of it first. And that, for my simplistic brain, I like that. It's like, after hearing that conversation, you and I had a chat to kind of reflect on it and work out what did we want to get out of this project here. And I think my reflection on that is because if that isn't going towards your purpose or aim, then it won't be successful because you won't put the same amount of energy into it. You won't have the passion for it. So I felt that was a really valuable takeaway. It's interesting that we took the concept and had two different viewpoints on what it meant.
All perspectives are welcomed. And maybe that comes back down to my first point around what is the question we're trying to answer here with this project. And I think there are probably multiple questions, but that's something I've been thinking about a little bit. Like we set out with a question, I think, around maybe what does rewilding look like in this landscape? But I think the questions have got much broader now, and the questions are now around how do we influence our community to help increase nature connectivity, or what does that look like? Or how do we help maybe naively to contribute to a regenerative system in this area? I don't know, maybe these are all just
I think we started off from a different perspective. I mean, I thought we started off with how do we do what we can to mitigate the effects of climate change. That was the first.
You're quite right.
That first step.
Absolutely. That was the first step of the journey.
And then we realized, right, let's plant trees. And then we realized just planting trees isn't going to solve anything. And then we're like, oh, there's a biodiversity loss crisis. Then we're like, right, well, how do we help support biodiversity, which is also good for climate change? And then we've gone on to, well, okay, how do we do the holistic challenges here? How do we make sure it's still producing food that's as much, if not more than before? How do we ensure that we're engaging as many people because we think there's an education challenge here? How do we ensure we support businesses locally to make them successful? So it becomes more holistic, the more systemic challenges we become aware of.
I think you articulated that much better than I did. But it's something around, how do we contribute to the future we choose? What does that look like?
Yeah. And I think, my prediction is that Matt's vision will change again once he learns more, and it will constantly evolve as society and the world evolves. We have to come to the realization the world doesn't stand still. You don't just take a snapshot of the world and then decide, right, that's a snapshot of the world. This is the way we move forward with success. It's unfortunately, because of technology and exponential growth and everything else, everything changes so rapidly that you've got to be so fluid in your approach and always willing to take on board more information and always willing to pivot if you actually want to drive change or success.
And that's not easy because that's uncomfortable, making changes or taking risks, going back on things that you've done and undoing the work. But actually, that's the sort of mindset we need, don't we, to be able to move forward and hold the complexity of the current situation.
How do you say you're wrong? You were wrong. Like I made a decision 6 months ago or 12 months ago with the whole heart belief that I was right. And actually, on reflection, with more information, I now know I'm wrong and I'm changing. Is a really hard thing to say to yourself, let alone publicly. Right. That's a lot of reflection for people, isn't it?
And it's already quite a long episode, but hopefully people have found value because, I found value in it. So thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. My therapy charges are, right, perfect. As always, if you've got this far, you're enjoying what we're talking about, then all we ask is that you take 5 minutes to rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you're on, and it surely bumps us up the rankings. More recently, we've had an interesting bump in downloads, which is nice to see. No reason, because we hadn't released an episode. So something happened, which is good.
Mysterious.
Yeah. But until then, is this the last episode for Christmas? We're doing another one.
Ooh.
Let's say have a great Christmas, everybody, and a nice new year. And then if there's a bonus episode, hey, happy days.
Let's give ourselves till after Christmas for the next episode. How about that?
All right. Bye-bye.